Good morning, it's Manager Critic Monday, and today we're talking about how to set boundaries in your relationships. So a big thank you to the lovely person who sent me a message and asked me this question. It really helps me to come up with content that is useful and relevant and in the moment. So please don't forget, if you're watching these videos and you are struggling to do more of what you love, delegate the stuff you don't, and ditch the critic that says you can't, then please private message me or comment below. What is it you're struggling with? What is it you want to change that isn't changing? And please ask the questions. And whilst I will take you through, as I always do, the listening detective process, which is 3 steps to gain clarity of what you want, the confidence to make it happen, I will also share my model, but I'm also going to encourage you to share your models. I want us to make this a two-way conversation, because what I've discovered over the years is that first thing is to get clarity of what you mean by what you say. Second thing is to understand the process to get from where you are now to where you want to be. But ultimately, if you want things to change, you have to be able to listen to other models and find out how other people do things differently, and then you can update or change yours. But it's really easy to keep changing what you're doing without really understanding why you're doing it, and purely just to try and stop yourself from upsetting people or causing conflict or arguments. So how to set boundaries in your relationships. How I do it, as those of you who will know this process inside out, is the first step is clarity. So check, what do I mean by what I say? So if I take the statement, how to set boundaries in my relationship, I'll be looking at what kind of setting, what kind of boundaries, and what kind of relationships. And so even when I just think about that right now, there's lots of levels. There'll be my personal relationships, the people that I live with and often work with as well. There'll be people that I'm working with, so that'll be my PA and my Facebook manager and my video editors, the people that help me to run the company. There'll be my clients, then there's my networking buddies, who else might there be, and then might be people in the local community. But what I'm noticing for me, the relationships, is actually here, those boundaries and what works for me have to be clear, because it's the people who I spend the most time with that really matters. So if you're struggling to do more of what you love, delegate the stuff you don't, and ditch the critic you said you can't, and things are not okay at home, there's a really good chance it's going to impact work. If you're not setting boundaries at work, then it's going to impact things at home. So I'm noticing, for me personally, there's the home world, and then there's the work. But what I know from my own patterns, I often don't include, is, do I have some boundaries for myself, my relationship with myself? What does that mean for me personally? So that's what I would do. So then I'd be looking at what kind of boundaries are those boundaries. And interestingly enough, I didn't put my glasses on so that you guys didn't have to keep watching the camera and the lights from the window reflecting, but it's giving me eye ache, so I'm going to put them back on. There's a really good example of a boundary. I might know what's really good for you, and I might want to honour that boundary, honour and respect that, knowing that if my glasses are reflecting, it's harder for you to get eye contact, it's harder for you to listen, it's harder for you to pay attention, but actually it's causing me discomfort. That's when the boundary for me is I can be uncomfortable for a period of time, but there's a certain discomfort I won't do. So my boundaries are, this is what I need to be able to work, learn and live at my best. And I'm aware of how long and how often I can be outside what works. And my boundaries is my limit to how flexible I can be outside what works for me. So they're my boundaries. Now the trouble with me, and I noticed this last week, is I don't always recognise that my boundaries have been crossed, or that I haven't even set the boundaries, that I haven't even explained to people what it is I need to be able to work, learn and live at my best. So one of the things I would be really clear about, if I was asking myself the question, how do I set boundaries with relationships, I'd be really clear what kind of boundaries. And one of the things that definitely occurred for me over the weekend with Mother's Day, I was asked if my Mother's Day was just the way I'd like it to be. My first answer was, I'd like to be on my own. I didn't say that out loud to my children, because that would be very unkind and very not very thoughtful. And kind and thoughtful is one of the things that I strive to be as often as possible. Recognizing that what I really wanted was to be with them, and I obviously was needing time alone, I took some time out Saturday afternoon to be on my own, to give myself that alone time so that being together would be okay. So for me, the boundaries are often between alone time and together time. Boundaries are also to do with core values, about what's important to me. So things like, dishonesty, discrimination, inequality, lying, thieving. I have some real strong boundaries where that is not okay. However, over the years of doing all this work, I've also realised that I might have a value of honesty. And right then in that moment, when my children asked me how if my day was just the way I'd like it to be, I wasn't honest. I didn't tell them what I was really thinking, because it wasn't kind, and there was also a sense of that wasn't really what I wanted. I wanted to be okay with them, but right in that moment, how I was feeling is I wanted time alone. So I think with me, honesty has there's a filter of, is this the right time? What's the purpose of saying this? What's the impact it's going to have? So with boundaries, I think you first have to think, what kind of boundaries are those boundaries? What do you actually want to have happen? And what's the purpose of setting them? And then the next thing I'd be focusing on is the setting of, what needs to happen for you to set a boundary, and what kind of set. Now, boundaries for me used to be like, wooden boxes. They were very firm. They didn't change. This is what was going to happen. And what I discovered is that I need them now to be, they're a lot more flexible. So they tend to be sort of wobbly, wibbly, sort of rubbery lines that can be flexed in and out. Even to the point that, and one of my, even if someone breaks one of my core values, something that's really not important, something that really matters to me, I will have this flexibility where I want to understand why. So if they have been dishonest and they haven't told me the truth, I need to think about how did I show up? What was I doing that made it not okay for them to tell the truth? Do they feel that they might be shamed, or they would have been, I would have got angry, or I would have got upset? I have to own my own reactions and responses as to why someone didn't feel they could be honest with me. And whilst people may have patterns of not having the courage to say what they're really thinking, or is it because they're not being honest because they are so busy trying to please people that they actually don't know what the truth is for them right now? So good morning, whoever's just joined me, please pop a comment below. Talking about how to set boundaries in relationships, and I'm just talking about, for me, the first step is always clarity. So what do I mean by set? So for me, there'll be certain things that are these are important to me, and if somebody else isn't able to honour that boundary, what I've noticed is I'm quite happy to sort of sit on the boundary fence, if you like, and have a conversation with somebody about it. And what might happen is, if my boundary is like a fence, and I've set it right, this is the rules, this is how I want to live my life, and somebody says, they pushes against that boundary, what I tend to do now is sit on the fence, have a discussion with them, learn from them about what's the impact of having that boundary there, what happens, what doesn't happen, and then often what happens is that the boundary may move, or I go, absolutely, I really respect that's how you do it, but I really need to set that boundary right now. And what I know for me is that boundaries, there are some that used to be so permanent, so rigid, they weren't flexible, I wouldn't change them. And there's still some that are core values, but there's always this level of curiosity. If someone's pushing against my boundaries, it makes me check in with myself, why is this important to me? How often do I need these conditions, these environments? If they that curiosity often then helps me challenge myself and make sure my values are still the true and those boundaries are correct for me, but often what it does is actually help me flex my boundaries so that I'm more resourced to deal with lots of different situations. So as I think about setting boundaries, the metaphor that comes to mind is sort of like fence panels going in, but like fence panels, they can be lifted up and out. Not particularly easily, they're not light, but at least they can be shifted and moved. So if I need to step in and out of those boundaries, I can do that. So there's a certain amount of protection and a certain amount of reliability, but these are the boundaries, this is what works for me. But there is some flexibility. So let's take the metaphor then of a boundary being, here's my fence, I've put it up, this is the space I need, this is what works for me. I can take the panels in and out and be flexible with people. But if all of the panels were out, I would be quite exposed, and I wouldn't feel probably as safe as I'd like to, because if things are not stable enough for me. So for me, what I'm noticing is how I set boundaries. So I have an idea of what works for me, and that comes out as my fence panel. I can lift them in and out occasionally for people, but if everybody, it's more to do with how often, how many people, and in how many areas of my life am being asked to stretch my boundaries or having my boundaries pushed. And I know for me and my journey, what definitely happened for me was that I was okay with my boundaries being pushed at home, but when it was pushed at home and at work and then personally, that's when I was at sort of a breaking point. So it's like when all of these fence panels had been lifted up and there was nothing left that made me feel safe or secure, or so there was nothing that was dependable, nothing that was sort of stable, that was staying the same. That's when it was more difficult for me. So that's my model. As you know, as a listening detective, this isn't about me teaching you what my model is. It's about asking you questions so that you can think about what your model is. So think today, for you, how do you set boundaries? So the first thing is I get clarity of what I do. The second thing I think is, so what happens just before I put a fence panel up? And when I put a fence panel up, what kind of fence panel is that? And then what happens? So then I have to look at the process. So I've got to think about what I want and why do I want it. So that's the purpose. Then I'm thinking about the process. How do I go about it? So what's the sequence of events that goes on before it happens? And so usually, like a fence, it's there for protection. It's to keep me safe. So a boundary might be that I need to get 8 hours sleep, for example. A boundary might be that I need to eat really healthy food and exercise daily in order to feel at my best. A boundary might be that I need to have so much alone time. A boundary might be that I need to have someone to talk to when I've got a problem to try and solve and I want to sort of talk through an idea. So the first thing is I'm just trying to think what happens before that. So that's how I would do it. It's like what happens just before, then what happens in between. So I'm just noticing that maybe sometimes they're 6-foot panels, sometimes they're only those 3-foot ones, sometimes they're ones with holes in, so they're kind of not a real, so I have different kinds of boundaries. And what happens is just before the boundary goes in place is I think it's dependent on what the weather's like, but also I'm just thinking about my own garden right now. So we've got in my back garden, I've got a wall and then a solid panel at one end where we want complete privacy from our neighbours, and then at the other end, because we get on really well with the neighbours, we've got holes in there's like a trellis, and we talk to each other through those fences. So there's a bit here that's got some privacy, so there's some solidness about it, and there's some flexibility bits. So actually the process I have to go through is I have to know what I need to work and live at my best, and I need to know how often. What's the frequency? How much time do I need to spend in this time, and how much time in that space where it's more open versus where it's a bit more secluded, a bit more protected. So that's how I go about it. So think about yourself. How do you set boundaries? What do you mean by boundaries? What kind of relationships and what kind of set is that for you? What happens in between, or what happens just before you set a boundary, whatever your metaphor is? Mine happens to be a fence. I'd love to know what yours is. So a boundary for you is like what? Setting a boundary for you is like what? And relationships for you are like what? Get clear about what you mean by what you say, and then think about what happens just before and then what happens. Get that process out, and then get curious about when do you change? What happens just before I take a fence panel out? What happens just before I put a fence panel in? What happens where before, my fence posts? And I guess it's a bit like the weather, isn't it? It's like sometimes there's a big storm and everything gets blown around, and my boundaries get pushed down, and sometimes those storms just come out of nowhere, you didn't know they were coming. But if you actually track the patterns, you can often work out what happened just before. And so how I do everything, and everyone who's worked with me will know there's 3 steps. It's clarity of what I mean by what I say. There's confidence in the process, what's the series of actions, but there's also an understanding of when do I change. You know, what happens just before I put a boundary up, and what happens just before I take a boundary down. What happens just before it goes from a full 6-foot panel that's like really protecting to just a trellis. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is trust. I've got to know people, I know that they know me, and I guess I know that them being them, they naturally do not step over my boundaries. They naturally need time on their own, so they'll separate from me. They'll naturally, just the way that we flow with each other, it basically feels like we're dancing, and it works okay. When I have to put a boundary in place, it's usually when we're either one of us is going through change, and the impact means we're out of flow, out of kilter, and something we're doing is now not working for the other person. So we just need to redefine what are the rules today in this moment for us to be at our best together. So that's when I will change those boundaries. And then I'm noticing that I can do that, but if lots of people are asking me to change and it lasts for a long period of time, I might then have to go back to the you know, how do I set boundaries, and redefine what boundaries I need to set. And it's always changing. I hope that's useful for you today. It's I look forward to seeing your comments. Please put a comment below, and I'll see you during the week.